The question, who discovered Europe, seems strange because Europe is often seen as something eternal. But its existence as a continent involves human migrations, geographical boundaries, and historical construction. Between ancient history, the Mediterranean world, and the Middle Ages, this idea was gradually formed over time. The narrative begins with a question that appears simple on the surface, yet complex in its historical meaning. Europe is often perceived as an ancient continent, clearly defined and fully known since immemorial. However, this perception contrasts with the ways in which European space was understood over time. Before existing as a clear geographical entity, Europe was named, interpreted, and organized in different ways. Human migrations, cultural contacts, and intellectual constructions progressively shaped this idea. It is from this initial point that the history begins to be examined in detail. If you enjoy this type of video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications to watch more videos like this. The idea discovery, as it was disseminated over the centuries, is usually linked to very specific images. Ships crossing unknown oceans, incomplete maps being filled in, and accounts describing lands previously absent from the European horizon. This model consolidated especially after maritime expansion, when Europe began to narrate its own history in relation to other continents. Within this framework, discovery meant arriving first, recording, naming, and integrating a territory into a system of knowledge. Europe in this scheme does not appear as an object of discovery, but as the point of departure. This asymmetry deeply shaped the way ancient and modern history came to be taught. The concept, therefore, emerged associated with a very specific historical experience. In textbooks and traditional narratives, discovery is often presented as a punctual event, a year, a name, a place, a clearly defined crossing. The discovery of the Americas, for example, is frequently reduced to a date and an expedition, even though the continent was already inhabited by ancient peoples. This simplification turned discovery into an almost administrative act, linked to written records and recognition by a specific civilization. The central criterion ceased to be human presence and became documented contact. This model was naturalized over time and applied almost automatically. As a result, the very notion of discovery acquired rigid contours, and it is from this rigidity that the first tensions arise when one tries to apply it to Europe. Europe, as a continent, has always occupied a different position within this logic. Unlike the Americas, Africa, and Asia, described as spaces to be known, Europe was treated as a familiar setting. However, this familiarity is the result of a later historical construction. The idea that Europe was always known ignores the processes of human migrations that shaped the continent since prehistory. Ancient peoples occupied, crossed, and transformed this space long before any clear geographical definition existed. Even so, the classical notion of discovery does not consider these movements as discoveries. The criterion remains centered on writing, record, and the perspective of those who narrate. This creates an initial mismatch between concept and historical reality. When one observes ancient history, it becomes clear that the concept of discovery did not operate in the same way. For the peoples of the Mediterranean world, knowledge of space was gradual, fragmented, and relational. Lands were known as they were traversed, traded with, or mentioned in oral accounts. There was no clear distinction between a known world and an unknown world in modern terms. Ancient Greece, for example, did not think in terms of fully defined continents. Even authors such as Herodotus described regions based on indirect reports, travels, and local traditions. Even so, later historiography reinterpreted these records through the modern lens of discovery. This conceptual shift alters the original meaning of the sources. The classical notion of discovery is also linked to the idea of cultural centrality. To discover in this model implies departing from a center that observes a periphery. Europe, by placing itself as a reference during modern expansion, began to narrate the world from its own standpoint. This point of view influenced the way continents were classified, named, and hierarchized. The European continent, by being at the center of this narrative process, ceased to be seen as something to be discovered. It came to be treated as a natural, almost immutable given. This perception consolidated over the centuries and crossed the Middle Ages into the formation of modern thought. The concept of discovery, therefore, carries a specific perspective. In the Roman Empire, this logic was not yet fully formed. Rome integrated territories of Europe, Africa, and Asia within a single political and cultural system. The Roman world was defined more by networks of power and administration than by separated continents. The idea of Europe as a distinct unit was not central to Roman thinking. Even so, later historiography reinterpreted the Roman past through the modern categories of discovery. This anachronism reinforced the idea that Europe had always been fully known. Once again, the concept distances itself from the actual historical experience. By observing this trajectory, it becomes clear that the classical notion of discovery did not arise in a neutral manner. It was shaped by specific interests, practices, and contexts, especially from modernity onward. This model came to guide the reading of the past and the organization of global history. However, when one attempts to apply it to Europe, difficult gaps emerge. The continent appears as an exception within a concept created for other spaces. This initial tension does not resolve the question, but deepens it. From this point, space opens up to examine other possible criteria, and it is precisely at this moment that the narrative moves forward to the next stage. Long before any map, name, or geographical boundary, Europe was already part of the routes of human migrations. The first groups of Homo sapiens left the African continent and gradually advanced into other regions of the planet. This movement began tens of thousands of years before any written record. Around 45,000 years ago, human groups were already occupying parts of the European regions, adapting to varied climates. Europe, at this moment, was not a concept, but a physical space crossed by ancient peoples. These migrations are part of the ancient history of humanity as a whole. These groups did not move in a sudden or organized way along fixed routes. Human migrations occurred over generations, driven by climatic changes, resource availability, and population dynamics. Small groups advanced, settled temporarily, and moved on. The European continent was occupied in a fragmented manner, without any awareness of territorial unity. There was no idea of Europe as a continent distinct from Asia or Africa. There were only lands, rivers, mountains, and zones of survival. This gradual occupation contrasts sharply with the classical notion of discovery associated with punctual events. Throughout this process, different human groups coexisted within European territory. In addition to Homo sapiens, populations such as the Neanderthals inhabited wide regions of the continent for thousands of years. Contact between these groups was part of prehistoric human dynamics. Archaeological evidence indicates genetic and cultural exchanges, revealing a complex history of occupation. These interactions occurred long before any notion of European identity. The continent was a space of circulation and adaptation, not a defined territory. The idea of discovery in this context finds no clear starting point. Over time, human populations spread across almost the entire extent of the continent. From the southern Mediterranean to more northern regions, human groups learned to deal with diverse environments. Adaptation to cold climates, the hunting of large animals, and the use of tools marked this period. Each region developed its own practices, shaped by the local environment. Even so, these differences did not create fixed borders. What existed was a territorial continuity inhabited by ancient peoples in constant movement. Europe, at this stage, was part of a larger world of human migrations. When observed from this prehistoric horizon, the question of who discovered Europe loses its traditional meaning. The continent was not found by an external group, but progressively occupied by populations already part of human history. These migrations were not recorded in texts or maps, but they left traces in the soil, fossils, and archaeological objects. The absence of writing does not mean the absence of history. On the contrary, this period represents most of the human experience on the European continent. Even so, it's often marginalized in classical narratives of discovery. This ancient occupation also reveals that Europe was never isolated. From the beginning, it was part of a continuous system of lands connected to Asia and Africa. There was no clear separation between continents, only geographical transitions. What are now called continental borders did not exist as concepts for these groups. They moved along natural routes, ignoring later divisions. This territorial continuity reinforces the difficulty of applying the modern notion of continent to the remote past. Europe, at that time, was not perceived as a distinct entity. By considering prehistoric human migrations, it becomes evident that human presence in Europe predates any formal cultural or geographical definition. The continent was already inhabited long before ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, or the Middle Ages. This observation does not directly answer the initial question, but it shifts the narrative focus. Europe first appears as a lived and traversed space, not as a named concept. From this ancient foundation, other ways of understanding the territory begin to develop. It is at this point that the historical narrative moves toward a new comparison. The comparison between Europe and the Americas begins in the field of prehistoric human migrations. Just as occurred on the European continent, the Americas were occupied by human groups that gradually moved from other regions. Archaeological evidence indicates that populations originating in Asia crossed the region known as Beringia during periods of glaciation. This natural corridor connected Siberia to what is now Alaska and allowed human entry into the American continent. The process unfolded over thousands of years with successive migratory waves. These groups spread across different environments and developed diverse cultures. The peopling of the Americas, in this sense, was a continuous and prolonged process. Despite this structural similarity, historical narrative treated the two continents differently. In the case of the Americas, the concept of discovery was widely applied following European contact at the end of the 15th century. Earlier human presence, dating back tens of thousands of years, was often placed in the background. Europe, although also occupied by ancient human migrations, is rarely approached through this same logic. The migratory criterion, when applied to the Americas, is acknowledged in archaeological studies, but does not define the idea of discovery. This difference reveals an asymmetry in how continents are narrated. The comparison shows that the concept is not based solely on the initial human presence. When the peopling of the Americas is observed in detail, it becomes clear that there was no single moment of arrival. Different groups advanced southward, gradually occupying the continent. Coastal regions, plains, and mountainous areas were settled as environmental conditions allowed. This process is comparable to what occurred in Europe during prehistory. In both cases, occupation happened without maps, continental names, or written records. Even so, only in the American case is this history commonly separated from the idea of discovery. This distinction reinforces the constructed nature of the concept. Beringia, as a land bridge, played a role similar to the natural connections between Europe, Asia, and Africa. Just as there was no clear separation among these spaces in the remote past, there was also no absolute division between Asia and the Americas during glacial periods. Human migrations ignored modern geographical borders. Movement followed environmental opportunities and accessible routes. This territorial continuity challenges the notion of continents as fixed and isolated entities. The comparison between Europe and the Americas shows that both continents were occupied through similar processes. The different historical treatment does not stem from the nature of those processes, but from how they were later interpreted. Over time, historiography came to separate occupation and discovery as distinct categories. Prehistoric occupation became associated with archaeology and ancient history, while discovery was linked to the modern era and written records. In the case of the Americas, this separation became particularly evident. European arrival came to be seen as the central milestone, regardless of the long prior history. In Europe, this same logic was not applied because there was no external other claiming the act of discovery. The comparison exposes a self-referential criterion present in historical narrative. The concept adjusts itself to the perspective of those who write. This difference in treatment is also connected to the formation of European identity. Europe, by positioning itself as the narrative center during modernity, came to define the parameters of global history. The Americas were inserted into this narrative as discovered spaces, while Europe remained an implicit reference. European prehistoric peopling was not reinterpreted as discovery because it did not serve that framework. American peopling, on the other hand, was reconfigured from the moment of European contact. The comparison makes clear that the concept of discovery depends more on historical and cultural context than on the migratory process itself. This observation keeps the initial question open. By putting side by side the peopling of Europe and the Americas, it becomes possible to observe the limits of the traditional model of discovery. Both continents were occupied by ancient human migrations following similar dynamics, yet only one of them was incorporated into the classical narrative of discovery. This difference does not resolve the central question, but shifts attention to the criteria being used. The comparison shows that the idea of discovery cannot be sustained solely by the chronology of occupation. From this contrast, the narrative moves toward another way of understanding the term. It is in this movement that the next axis of the story begins to take shape. By moving away from the classical notion of discovery as a single and definitive event, another form of understanding emerges based on relative knowledge. In this framework, to discover means to come to know something that had not previously been part of a specific group's horizon. The object of discovery already existed, but it was not integrated into the cultural, geographical, or symbolic repertoire of the observer. Discovery, therefore, does not create the territory or the people. It merely establishes contact. This contact is always conditioned by available routes, the intentions behind the encounter, and the capacity for record-keeping. The concept ceases to be absolute and becomes dependent on historical perspective. This shift profoundly alters the traditional meaning of the term. This logic can be understood through the idea of progressive familiarity with space. A place may exist for centuries without being known to certain human groups. When that place enters someone's field of experience, a relative discovery occurs. Nothing changes in the territory itself, but the relationship between observer and observed space is transformed. In ancient history, this process was common in regions connected by trade, war, or migration. Knowledge circulated in fragmented ways without the ambition of encompassing continental totalities. Discovery, therefore, does not create the territory or the people. It merely establishes contact. This contact is always conditioned by available routes, the intentions behind the encounter, and the capacity for record-keeping. The concept ceases to be absolute and becomes dependent on historical perspective. This shift profoundly alters the traditional meaning of the term. This logic can be understood through the idea of progressive familiarity with space.
A place may exist for centuries without being known to certain human groups. When that place enters someone's field of experience, a relative discovery occurs. Nothing changes in the territory itself, but the relationship between observer and observed space is transformed. In ancient history, this process was common in regions connected by trade, war, or migration. Knowledge circulated in fragmented ways without the ambition of encompassing continental totalities. Discovery, therefore, does not create the territory or the people. It merely establishes contact. This contact is always conditioned by available routes, the intentions behind the encounter, and the capacity for record-keeping. The concept ceases to be absolute and becomes dependent on historical perspective. This shift profoundly alters the traditional meaning of the term. Historical accounts by travelers and observers reinforce this idea of relative knowledge. Texts produced throughout ancient and medieval history describe peoples, cities, and regions based on limited experiences. These records did not aim to represent entire continents, but to narrate what was seen or heard. Often the same region appears in different ways depending on the author. The knowledge produced was cumulative, but never total. Each discovery added a layer to the understanding of the world. Even so, these partial descriptions were later integrated into broader narratives. The fragmented character of knowledge tends to be obscured in later historiography. When this logic is applied to Europe, the complexity of the initial question becomes more evident. Europe was gradually known by different peoples over time. Merchants, travelers, and emissaries from regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East came into contact with parts of the European continent. Each of these encounters generated specific descriptions, limited to the routes traveled. None of these accounts sought to define Europe as a whole. Knowledge was regional, conditioned by the context of contact. Europe, therefore, was discovered repeatedly, always in a relative and incomplete manner. This relativity is also evident within the European space itself. For long periods, certain regions remained little known even to nearby populations. Mountain ranges, dense forests, and rural areas escaped administrative control and written record. Knowledge of the territory varied according to social position, economic activity, and access to writing. Urban elites were familiar with spaces that remained distant to local populations. The idea of a fully known Europe does not correspond to concrete historical experience. Knowledge was always unevenly distributed. Discovery, in this sense, was never homogeneous. By treating discovery as relative knowledge, the focus of the narrative shifts from an inaugural act to a continuous process. There is no single discoverer and no definitive moment. There is a succession of encounters, descriptions, and records that gradually expand understanding of space. Europe, in this framework, does not emerge as a continent revealed all at once. It appears as a territory progressively known, reinterpreted, and described over time. This perspective does not close the initial question, but prepares the ground for another level of analysis. The narrative then advances to discuss when and how Europe began to be thought of as a continent in itself.
Cultural contacts throughout history produced discoveries that did not follow a single direction. Whenever different peoples encountered one another, there was reciprocal recognition, even if recorded in unequal ways. Merchants, travelers, soldiers, and envoys crossed land and sea routes, establishing contact between different societies. These encounters did not imply immediate domination or complete understanding of the other. Each side observed, described, and interpreted what appeared unfamiliar. Discovery, in this scenario, emerged as a result of direct contact. It reflected the limits of the observer's experience. Thus, the knowledge produced was always situated. In the Mediterranean world, this type of contact was constant since ancient history. Peoples of ancient Greece, North Africa, and the Near East maintained commercial and diplomatic relations for centuries. Through these interactions, cities, customs, and beliefs were gradually known. Greek mythology, for example, preserves echoes of these contacts by narrating origins and movements linked to distant regions. These accounts did not describe entire continents, but specific zones of contact. Europe, in this context, appeared as part of a relational space rather than an isolated unit. Each encounter expanded knowledge without exhausting it. Cultural contact also produced selective descriptions of European space. Peoples external to Europe came into contact with coastal regions, ports, and specific urban centers. These points of access shaped the images recorded about the continent. Interior regions remained unknown or were mentioned only indirectly. The knowledge resulting from these contacts did not aim to be complete. It responded to practical needs of commerce, diplomacy, or warfare. Discovery, therefore, followed concrete and circumstantial interests. The European continent was perceived through fragments rather than as a totality. These mutual discoveries also occurred in the opposite direction. Europeans came into contact with societies from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, expanding their own cultural horizons. Products, techniques, and ideas circulated along with people and accounts. Each encounter altered perceptions of a known world. However, this knowledge was filtered through local traditions and prior expectations. Europe did not position itself as a neutral observer, nor were other peoples merely objects of observation. Contact produced transformations on both sides. Discovery was therefore a shared process. Over time, these cultural contacts were recorded in different ways. Some accounts survived in written texts, while others remained in oral tradition. Writing allowed certain descriptions to gain wider circulation and permanence. This contributed to some discoveries being broadly disseminated, while others were lost. Record-keeping did not necessarily reflect the importance of contact, but the social position of those who wrote. Discovery, in this sense, was linked to the capacity to record and transmit. The resulting historical knowledge is marked by these asymmetries. In the case of Europe, cultural contacts did not produce an immediate definition of the continent. They accumulated dispersed information about peoples, regions, and routes. The idea of Europe did not emerge directly from these encounters, but was gradually constructed from them over time. Each mutual discovery added data, names, and images to the collective repertoire. Even so, a synthesis capable of transforming these fragments into a unified concept was still lacking. The continent remained a practical reality rather than a conceptual one. Cultural discovery preceded geographical definition. By considering mutual discoveries in cultural contact, it becomes evident that historical knowledge formed in a relational manner. No people discovered another in an isolated or definitive way. What existed was a network of encounters that progressively expanded understanding of the world. Europe participated in this process as a space of passage, contact, and exchange. These discoveries did not close the initial question, but deepened its complexity. They showed that discovery is not limited to finding unknown lands. The narrative then moves forward to examine how these contacts were recorded by specific observers.
Historical accounts constitute one of the main ways through which the past was recorded and transmitted. Throughout ancient and medieval history, travelers, envoys, and chroniclers described peoples and regions based on direct or indirect experiences. These texts did not seek to offer a total vision of the known world, but to record specific observations made in determined contexts. Each account reflects the author's route, cultural references, and purpose of writing. The discovery registered in these documents is always localized and circumstantial. The text preserves what was seen, heard, or interpreted. Thus, historical knowledge emerges as a mosaic of perspectives. When accounts produced in different contexts are compared, it becomes possible to perceive common patterns and limitations. Observers describe customs, clothing, religious practices, and forms of social organization based on their own parameters. What draws attention in one account may be ignored in another. These choices reveal as much about the observer as about the observed. Europe, when it appears in these texts, emerges fragmented into specific regions, never as a fully defined continent. The same occurs with descriptions of other parts of the world. The comparison of accounts highlights the inherent partiality of each record. Historical knowledge results from the sum of these partialities. Accounts originating in the medieval Islamic world offer a clear example of this dynamic. Travelers and chroniclers recorded impressions of European regions based on commercial routes and diplomatic missions. The descriptions emphasize cities, markets, and political structures with which there was direct contact. Regions not traversed remain absent or are only vaguely mentioned. These texts did not intend to define Europe as a geographical or cultural unit. They recorded concrete experiences lived at specific points of the continent. Discovery, in this case, is inseparable from the route traveled. The account reflects the extent of the journey, not the totality of the territory. In a similar way, European chroniclers produced detailed descriptions of regions outside the continent. These accounts emphasized what seemed strange or noteworthy within their own frames of reference. The knowledge produced was organized according to categories familiar to the author. Comparing these texts with accounts produced outside Europe reveals methodological symmetries. Both record the other through internal parameters without any claim of exhaustiveness. The discovery narrated is always partial, mediated by language and context. The historical account thus functions as a limited window onto broader realities. Writing plays a central role in this process of comparison. Only what was recorded in texts gained permanence and wide circulation. Oral accounts, although important, rarely achieved the same historiographical status. This created an imbalance in the preservation of historical experiences. Certain points of view were amplified, while others were lost. Discovery, as it appears in historical accounts, is linked to the capacity to write and disseminate. The preserved knowledge reflects this asymmetry. To compare accounts also means to recognize these inequalities of record. By placing different accounts side by side, it becomes clear that none of them claims the total discovery of a continent. The texts describe encounters, routes, and punctual observations. Europe, like other regions, is presented through narrative fragments. These fragments accumulate over time, but do not automatically merge into a unified concept. The idea of a continent does not emerge directly from the accounts, but from later interpretations. The comparison reveals the distance between recorded experience and conceptual synthesis. The historical account provides raw material, not the final definition. The comparative analysis of historical accounts helps shift the focus away from the search for a single discoverer. What emerges is a continuous process of record and interpretation. Each text adds a layer to the collective understanding of space and peoples. Europe, in this process, was described from multiple angles, without this resulting in an immediate definition of a continent. Discovery appears as the cumulative result of dispersed observations. This realization does not conclude the narrative, but directs the discussion toward another dimension. From the accounts, the need arises to discuss the very concept of a continent.
The concept of a continent is often presented as something simple and objective, but its definition involves complex historical and geographical problems. In modern maps, continents appear as clearly delimited units, separated by oceans or clear boundaries. However, this representation is the result of conventions adopted over time. The very idea of dividing the world into continents was not uniform among different societies. Physical, cultural, and political criteria were used in different ways. A continent, in this sense, is not merely a natural given, it is also a historically constructed category. This realization calls into question the apparent self-evidence of the concept. When Europe is observed in particular, this difficulty becomes even more visible. Unlike the Americas or Australia, Europe is not separated from Asia by an ocean. Both form a single continuous landmass, traditionally referred to as Eurasia. The boundaries that today separate Europe and Asia pass through mountain ranges, rivers, and imaginary lines. These limits have varied according to historical period and cultural tradition. There is no absolute natural consensus that determines where Europe ends and Asia begins. The European continent therefore depends on arbitrary definitions. This reveals the problematic character of the concept. Comparison with Africa reinforces this issue. The separation between Africa and Asia, for example, is marked by the Isthmus of Suez, a narrow strip of land connecting two large spaces. Throughout much of ancient history, this region was crossed by peoples, armies, and trade routes. Continental division did not prevent human circulation or cultural integration. Even so, Africa and Asia were treated as distinct continents. This example shows that physical criteria alone are insufficient to define continents. The decision to separate or unite spaces involves historical choices. Once again, the concept of continent proves to be relative. In the case of the Americas, the situation appears different at first glance. The presence of oceans on both sides contributed to the perception of a separate continent. Even so, the Americas were also subdivided into North America and South America based on equally conventional criteria. The Isthmus of Panama became a dividing line adopted for geographical convenience. This subdivision does not derive from an absolute natural rupture. It reflects decisions taken in specific historical contexts. The very notion of how many continents exist varies according to educational and cultural tradition. This highlights the flexibility of the concept. In ancient history, these continental divisions did not carry the same weight they do today. Peoples of the Mediterranean world conceived space in terms of seas, regions, and zones of influence, not closed continents. The Mediterranean functioned as an axis of connection rather than a boundary. Ancient Greece, North Africa, and the Near East were integrated through maritime and land routes. The idea of a continent, as currently understood, did not organize perceptions of the world. This conceptual absence shows that the continent is a later category. It was gradually formulated as geographical knowledge expanded. Throughout the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, the concept of continent gained greater definition. Maps began to represent the world in a more systematic way, incorporating more stable continental boundaries. Even so, these representations reflected cultural and religious values. Europe, for example, began to be highlighted as a differentiated space within Christendom. The division between Europe, Asia, and Africa came to carry symbolic meanings beyond the geographical. The continent ceased to be only a physical space and became associated with collective identities. This process reinforced the use of the concept without eliminating its ambiguities. In analyzing the problem of the concept of continent, it becomes evident that it does not provide a solid basis for answering the initial question. Europe cannot be treated as a continent naturally given since time immemorial. Its definition depends on historical, cultural, and cartographic criteria. The continent emerges as the result of progressive classifications rather than a punctual discovery. This realization does not close the narrative, but shifts the focus of the investigation. From questioning the concept of continent, space opens to understand how Europe was intellectually conceived. It is at this point that the narrative advances to the next stage.
Europe, before being understood as a defined continent, existed as an idea in formation. This idea did not arise from direct observation of nature,
but from human attempts to organize the known world. To think about Europe meant to assign meaning to regions, peoples, and spaces that already physically existed. The concept was shaped through narratives, classifications, and comparisons. There was no single initial point for this intellectual formulation. The process unfolded gradually, accompanying the expansion of geographical knowledge. Europe, at this stage, was more a mental category than a closed territorial reality. In ancient history, especially within the context of ancient Greece, the world began to be described and interpreted through abstract concepts. Philosophers, historians, and geographers sought to understand the organization of the inhabited space. The use of names for large regions helped structure this understanding. Europe came to be mentioned as one of these regions, alongside Asia and Africa. However, these terms did not indicate continents in the modern sense. They functioned as broad references without rigid boundaries. Europe, at this moment, was an intellectual notion under construction, linked to the experience of the Mediterranean world. The contribution of authors from ancient Greece was central to this process. Writers such as Herodotus reflected on the division of the known world and expressed doubts about its criteria. When treating Europe, Asia, and Africa as distinct parts, these authors also recognized the arbitrariness of such separations. Boundaries were described based on rivers, seas, and traditions, not on incontestable natural limits. The very discussion of where each region began or ended reveals the intellectual character of the classification. Europe emerged as the result of an explanatory effort rather than an absolute geographical certainty. The concept was debated, not simply accepted. Beyond historical and geographical reflection, Greek mythology also contributed to the symbolic formation of Europe. The myth of Europa of Tyre, associated with Zeus in the form of a bull, places the name Europe within a narrative of movement and cultural contact. This story connects the Near East to the Aegean world, reinforcing the idea of circulation between regions. The use of the name Europe in a mythological context precedes any precise territorial definition. Europe, in this sense, appears as a symbol before becoming a delimited space. Mythology does not define borders, but it gives cultural meaning to the name. This symbolic dimension reinforces the constructed nature of the concept. Over time, these intellectual references were reinterpreted. Europe began to be thought of not merely as one region among others, but as a space with its own characteristics. Even so, this differentiation was neither uniform nor immediate. For centuries, the world was conceived primarily from the Mediterranean perspective, which integrated different regions into a single system. Europe did not occupy an isolated central position. It was part of a broader network of cultural and political relations. The intellectual construction of Europe advanced slowly, without a clear rupture. The concept remained in formation. From the Roman Empire onward and in later periods, these ideas inherited from antiquity continued to circulate. Writers and cartographers revisited ancient categories to organize the known world. Europe began to appear more frequently on maps and texts, even though its boundaries varied. The concept gained stability without losing its interpretive character. This was not a sudden discovery, but a progressive consolidation. Europe affirmed itself as a shared idea, constructed by successive generations. This intellectual continuity was fundamental to its historical persistence. By understanding Europe as an intellectual construction, it becomes possible to move away from the notion of a punctual discovery. The continent was not revealed at a specific moment, but thought, named, and redefined over time. Europe exists as the result of human classifications applied to an already inhabited space. This construction does not eliminate the physical reality of a territory, but explains how it acquired historical meaning. The concept of Europe emerges from the human effort to organize the known world.
From this intellectual foundation, other dimensions of European identity begin to develop. It is at this point that the narrative moves forward.
In ancient Greece, the effort to understand the known world began to take more systematic forms. Philosophers, geographers, and historians sought to organize inhabited space through broad categories. In this context, attempts emerged to divide the world into large regions, often called Europe, Asia, and Africa. These divisions did not have the fixed character they would acquire later. They functioned as intellectual tools to organize scattered information. Ancient Greece operated from the Mediterranean world, which served as a central reference. Europe, in this scenario, appeared as a notion under development. The concept was far from stable or fully defined. Herodotus occupies a central position in this process of reflection. Regarded as one of the principal historians of ancient history, he devoted much of his work to describing peoples, customs, and territories known through travel and reports. When mentioning Europe, Asia, and Africa, Herodotus did not present these regions as self-evident natural continents. On the contrary, he expressed unease with these divisions. In his texts, he questioned why the land should be divided in such a way. The boundaries between these regions were, for him, problematic. This attitude reveals a critical awareness regarding the categories used. Europe emerged as a debated construction, not as an unquestionable given. Herodotus's doubts reflect the nature of geographical knowledge in his time. Available information came from travelers, merchants, and local traditions. Knowledge of space was fragmented and depended on the routes traveled. Herodotus recorded this information without intending to offer an exact cartography of the world. His descriptions alternated between direct observation and second-hand reports. This produced a complex and sometimes contradictory image of the regions mentioned. Europe, in this context, did not possess precise contours. It was mentioned in relation to specific rivers, seas, and peoples. The concept remained open and debatable. The relationship between Europe and Asia exemplifies these difficulties well. For Herodotus and other Greek authors, the separation between these regions was not evident on the ground. The continental landmass was continuous, and divisions depended on conventional references. Rivers such as the Phasis or the Tanais were used at different moments as dividing lines. These choices varied according to the tradition adopted. There was no universally accepted criterion. Europe, therefore, was defined by mobile and negotiable limits. This instability reinforces the intellectual character of the classification. The continent was thought, not discovered. Beyond geography, Greek reflection also involved cultural comparisons. Herodotus described the customs of the peoples considered European, Asian, and African, highlighting similarities and differences. These descriptions did not seek to establish fixed continental hierarchies. They recorded practices observed in specific contexts. Europe was not presented as a homogeneous cultural unit. Different peoples occupied distinct regions with varied ways of life. The term Europe functioned more as a broad reference than as a common identity. This demonstrates that the idea of a European identity did not yet exist at that time. The Mediterranean world remained the organizing axis of these narratives. Greek cities, regions of Asia Minor, and areas in North Africa were deeply interconnected. Maritime routes facilitated cultural and economic exchange. Within this system, Europe did not occupy an isolated or central position. It was one part of this interconnected whole. The division into continents did not structure the daily experience of the Greeks. Herodotus's thinking reflects this integrated reality. Europe appeared as one among several possible references within a continuous world.
By analyzing ancient Greece and the work of Herodotus, it becomes clear that Europe was not conceived as a discovered continent. It emerged as the result of ongoing historical and geographical reflections. The doubts expressed by Herodotus showed that the division of the world was a matter of debate. Europe was an idea under construction, subject to revision and questioning. This initial stage does not conclude the process, but establishes its foundations. From these ancient reflections, other layers of meaning would be added to the concept. It is at this point that the narrative moves forward to examine new elements of this construction.
In Greek mythology, the name Europe appears long before any systematic attempt to define continents. It emerges within symbolic narratives that sought to explain origins, movements, and relationships between peoples. These myths were not intended to describe the world in cartographic terms, but to assign meaning to human experience. The name Europe in this context did not designate a delimited territory. It was linked to characters, stories, and movements within the Mediterranean world. Mythology functioned as a vehicle of cultural transmission. Thus, the name Europe began circulating on a narrative plane before any geographical definition. The most well-known myth associated with the name is that of Europa of Tyre. According to tradition, Europa was a princess from the Phoenician region, located on the coast of the Near East. The narrative describes her encounter with Zeus, who takes the form of a bull. This symbolic element is central to the story. Europa's displacement occurs from her land of origin to the island of Crete. This journey connects different regions of the Mediterranean world. The story does not present clear continental boundaries. It emphasizes movement, crossing, and contact between distinct cultural spaces. The name Europe becomes associated with this displacement. The choice of a character originating from the Near East is significant within the mythic narrative. Europa of Tyre is not born in a space that would later be called continental Europe. Her origin is linked to regions of Western Asia. The myth, therefore, does not reinforce a rigid separation between Europe and Asia. On the contrary, it suggests continuity and circulation between these areas. The name Europe emerges associated with cultural transit. This feature reflects the reality of the ancient Mediterranean world. The myth preserves the memory of frequent contact among coastal peoples. The name Europe is born within this relational environment. Greek mythology did not seek to establish exact geographical definitions. Its accounts combined symbolic, religious, and cultural elements. The use of the name Europe in these myths did not imply the existence of a continent bearing that name. It was a reference laden with narrative meaning. The later association of the name with a vast landmass is a distinct process. Initially, Europe was a proper name linked to a specific story. This symbolic use precedes any attempt at territorial classification. Mythology, in this sense, contributed to fixing the name, not to defining the space. The environment in which these myths circulated was marked by intense interaction among Mediterranean peoples. Navigation, trade, and colonization connected regions of Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, and the Levant. Mythological stories reflected this interconnected world. The name Europe circulated alongside other names associated with places and characters. There was no concern with rigidly distinguishing continents. The world was perceived as a set of seas and lands. Mythology mirrored this fluid perception of space. Mythic Europe was part of this integrated system. Over time, the name Europe came to be reused in different contexts. Greek authors began employing the term to designate broader regions. Even so, this transition was neither immediate nor uniform. The meaning of the name continued to carry traces of its mythic origin. Geographical Europe inherited a name that was born outside a precise territorial context.
This shift in meaning shows how concepts can be repurposed. The name remains while its meaning transforms. Mythology thus provides the symbolic foundation for later uses. By analyzing Greek mythology and the name Europe, it becomes clear that the term did not arise from a territorial discovery. It emerged from symbolic narratives linked to the Mediterranean world and experiences of cultural contact. The name predates the continent as a geographical concept. Europe, at this stage, is a mythical figure and a cultural reference, not a defined territorial entity. This trajectory reinforces the idea that Europe was constructed through different layers of meaning. From the name and the myth, new interpretations would be added over the course of history. It is at this point that the narrative moves forward to the next moment that is construction.
The ancient Mediterranean world functioned as a vast space of connection among diverse peoples. Seas, islands, and coastlines formed a continuous network of human circulation. Navigation enabled frequent movement between regions now associated with Europe, Africa, and Asia. This space was not perceived as divided into rigid continents. It was understood as an integrated system, articulated by commercial and cultural routes. Port cities played a central role in this functioning. Historical experience was organized around the sea, not around isolated land masses. The Mediterranean world structured perceptions of a known world. In this context, Europe did not occupy an exclusive central position. It was part of a broader set of interconnected regions. Greeks, Phoenicians, Egyptians, and other peoples shared circuits of exchange and communication. Products, techniques, and ideas circulated together with people. The sense of belonging was more closely tied to the city or the region than to a continent. Space was experienced in a practical and relational way. Europe emerged as one zone among many within this system. Its definition depended on the observer's position within the Mediterranean world. The continent was not yet an organizing reference. Commercial routes played a decisive role in this integration. Goods crossed the Mediterranean in all directions, linking distant regions. These routes also carried information, customs, and narratives. Knowledge of the world expanded through these contacts. However, this knowledge was fragmented and localized. Descriptions reflected specific journeys rather than a totalizing vision. Europe was known in parts through ports and coastal areas. Interior regions remained scarcely described. The Mediterranean world produced knowledge that was gradual and cumulative. Cities performed a central function within this ancient system. Athens, Rome, Carthage, Alexandria, and many others acted as points of convergence. These cities concentrated commerce, political power, and cultural production. Urban experience shaped perceptions of space and time. Europe, in this scenario, was experienced through its cities rather than as a continuous territorial unit. Belonging was defined by the polis or by the empire, not by the continent. This organization reinforces the absence of an ancient European identity. The Mediterranean world overlaid continental divisions. The cultural diversity of the ancient Mediterranean also prevented rigid classifications. Peoples with different languages, religions, and customs lived in close proximity. Frequent contact produced constant adaptations and exchanges. Europe was not perceived as a culturally homogeneous space. Different peoples occupied diverse regions within this system. Identity was multiple and contextual. Fixed borders had little practical relevance. The Mediterranean world functioned as a space of transition rather than separation. This fluidity shaped the historical experience of antiquity. Even conflicts and disputes reinforced this integration. Wars, alliances, and conquests followed the same commercial routes. Armies crossed seas and lands with relative continuity.
The Mediterranean space remained connected, even in contexts of confrontation. Europe participated in these dynamics without standing out as an autonomous entity. It was part of a broader scenario of political and military relations. The concept of continent did not guide these actions. Historical practice followed the logic of circulation. The Mediterranean world maintained its centrality. By understanding the ancient Mediterranean world, it becomes evident that Europe was conceived within this integrated system. Historical experience was not organized around continents, but around networks of contact. Europe was neither discovered as a unit nor lived as such. It existed as a set of regions embedded within a common space. This reality helps explain why European identity took so long to form. The Mediterranean preceded Europe as a historical reference. From this integrated world, new forms of organization would emerge. It is at this point that the narrative advances to the next stage.
The Roman Empire built one of the most extensive networks of connection in the ancient world. Its rule extended across regions now associated with Europe, Africa, and Asia, forming a continuous political space. Imperial organization was not based on continents, but on provinces administered in an integrated manner. Rome functioned as the center of decision-making, while cities spread throughout the empire ensured the application of laws and the collection of resources. This structure favored the constant circulation of people and goods. Imperial space was experienced as a unified system. Europe was part of this whole, without occupying an autonomous conceptual position. Roman roads played a fundamental role in this integration. Built for military and administrative purposes, they connected distant regions efficiently. Soldiers, merchants, officials, and travelers regularly moved along these routes. The roads linked ports, cities, and frontiers, reinforcing the territorial continuity of the empire. Circulation was not limited to continental Europe. Routes connected North Africa, the Near East, and the Italian peninsula. Constant movement reduced the perception of rigid separations. The Roman world was defined by connections rather than by continental divisions. Roman cities functioned as central nodes within this network. Urban centers such as Rome, Carthage, Antioch, and Alexandria articulated administration, commerce, and culture. Each city maintained direct links with other parts of the empire. Urban life shared architectural, legal, and institutional patterns. This created a common experience across distant regions. Europe, in this context, was lived through its provincial cities, integrated into the Roman system. The dominant identity was Roman, not European. Belonging was defined by the empire and by citizenship. The Mediterranean continued to be the main axis of integration during the Roman period. The sea facilitated large-scale transport and quickly connected different provinces. Ships carried grain, olive oil, wine, and other essential products. Information and administrative orders also circulated along these maritime routes. Control of the Mediterranean reinforced imperial cohesion. Europe was not separated from the rest of the empire by decisive natural barriers. It was inserted into the same maritime and land circuits. Roman space remained cohesive through these continuous connections. Roman administration reinforced this integration through shared norms. Laws, fiscal systems, and administrative practices were applied in a relatively uniform way. This created a framework of predictability in political and economic relations. The daily experience of the empire's inhabitants was shaped by these shared structures. Europe participated in this system as part of a broader order. There was no Roman project to define Europe as a distinct unit. The empire organized the world through centers and provinces. The concept of continent remained secondary. Cultural connections were also intense during Roman rule. Languages, religions, and customs circulated widely. Latin spread across vast regions, especially in the western part of the empire. Legal practices and urban models were adopted locally with adaptations. Cultural diversity coexisted with common elements. Europe, in this scenario, was a space of continuous cultural interaction. Its regions did not form a homogeneous bloc. They participated in a wider imperial mosaic. The empire promoted integration without eliminating regional differences. By observing the Roman Empire and its connections, it becomes evident that Europe was not conceived as an autonomous continent during this period. It was a functional part of an imperial structure that encompassed multiple regions. Roman space was defined by networks of circulation rather than by fixed continental borders. Historical experience was organized around the empire and the Mediterranean. This configuration helps explain why the idea of Europe took so long to acquire its own meaning. With the decline of Roman power, these connections would be transformed, opening the way for new forms of organization. It is from these changes that the narrative moves forward.
With the weakening of the structures of the Roman Empire, the European world underwent profound transformations. The former imperial administrative networks were gradually fragmented, altering political and territorial organization. In this new context, Christendom emerged as one of the main elements of cohesion. The Christian religion began to offer a common language for diverse populations. Monasteries, bishoprics, and dioceses structured new forms of social organization. Space ceased to be defined by Roman provinces and began to be articulated through religious bonds. Europe started to be conceived within this new medieval logic. The Church played a central role in preserving and reorganizing knowledge during the Middle Ages. Religious institutions maintained writing, education, and intellectual production. Latin became the common language of Western Christendom. This linguistic unity facilitated the circulation of texts and ideas across distant regions. Europe, in this context, came to be associated with a space of Latin Christians. This definition did not depend on rigid geographical borders. It was based on religious and cultural adherence. The continent began to acquire meaning through shared faith. The notion of Christendom also helped distinguish European space from other known worlds. Islamic, Byzantine, or pagan regions came to be perceived as external to this Western Christian universe. This distinction was not based solely on territory, but on religious belonging. Medieval Europe was defined in contrast to what lay outside Latin Christendom. This opposition helped create a collective spatial consciousness. Even so, this consciousness did not correspond to a modern European identity. It was a broad religious belonging rather than a clearly delimited continent. During the Middle Ages, kings and rulers sought legitimacy through their relationship with the Church. Political authority was often articulated alongside religious authority. This association reinforced the idea of a common Christian order. European space was conceived as part of a Christian world, governed by shared principles. Europe was not thought of as an isolated geographical unit, but as a spiritual community. This conception influenced medieval maps, chronicles, and documents. The continent was perceived through faith rather than physical geography. Christendom shaped the worldview. Human migrations and population movements also marked this period. Germanic, Slavic, and other peoples settled in different regions of the former Roman territory. The Christianization of these groups contributed to their integration into Western Christendom. Conversion functioned as a mechanism of cultural and political incorporation. Medieval Europe was formed through this gradual process of religious integration. European space expanded as new regions adopted Latin Christianity. The identity constructed was dynamic and progressive. It followed the diffusion of faith. Medieval intellectual production reflected this worldview.
Chronicles, maps, and treatises described known space through biblical and religious references. The world was often divided into regions associated with the descendants of Noah or major religious traditions. Europe appeared as part of the Western Christian world. These representations did not seek modern cartographic precision. They organized space according to symbolic and spiritual values. Christendom provided the primary criterion of order. The concept of continent remained secondary to religion. By considering the Middle Ages and Christendom, it becomes clear that Europe was conceived as a religious space before being understood as a geographical continent. Medieval unity was not based on natural borders, but on spiritual and cultural belonging. Europe was not discovered in this period, but reinterpreted through the Christian faith. This reorganization of space prepared the ground for new forms of collective identity. Over time, political and cultural elements would be added to this religious foundation. It is from these transformations that the narrative moves forward. Throughout the late Middle Ages, Europe began to be perceived through increasingly dense intellectual and cultural bonds. Monasteries, cathedrals, and urban schools functioned as centers of knowledge production and dissemination. Classical, religious, and legal texts circulated among distant regions. This circulation did not depend on a single central authority. It relied on informal networks of scholars and institutions. The experience of knowledge connected diverse territories. Europe started to gain cohesion through written culture. This cohesion was not territorial, but intellectual. Latin played a fundamental role in this process. As a scholarly language, it enabled communication among learned individuals from different regions. Emerging universities adopted Latin as the common language of teaching and debate. Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and other cities became intellectual hubs. Students and masters moved between these centers. Academic mobility reinforced the perception of a shared cultural space. Intellectual Europe was structured through these exchanges. Belonging was defined by access to common knowledge. The continent came to be experienced as a network of learning. Cultural production also contributed to this integration. Manuscripts, philosophical works, and scientific treatises were copied and commented upon. Ideas crossed political boundaries with relative ease. The heritage of ancient history, especially Greco-Roman, was reinterpreted in new contexts. This intellectual continuity created shared references. Europe recognized itself in a common repertoire of texts and authors. This identification did not require total cultural uniformity. It was based on the circulation of references. European space took shape on a symbolic and cultural level. The arts and literature also played a relevant role. Architectural styles such as Romanesque and Gothic spread across vast regions. Literary works circulated in versions adapted to different local languages. Despite variations, certain themes and forms were recognizable in diverse contexts. This diffusion created cultural affinities. Intellectual Europe did not eliminate regional differences. It articulated similarities within diversity. European cultural space consolidated through shared practices. Identity remained plural and relational. The development of universities reinforced this framework. These institutions did not belong exclusively to specific kingdoms. They attracted students from multiple origins. Similar curricula were adopted in different centers. The study of law, theology, and philosophy followed common patterns. This produced a relatively homogeneous intellectual formation among literate elites. Europe became recognizable as a space of intellectual formation. The continent took shape through education. This configuration preceded any modern political unity. Knowledge functioned as an integrating element. The circulation of ideas also intensified with the growing use of writing and later printing. Even before the printing press, networks of scribes ensured the diffusion of important works.
The transmission of knowledge did not depend solely on physical travel. Texts moved independently. This expanded the reach of ideas. Intellectual Europe grew with each new copy. Cultural space was constantly renewed. European construction advanced on the plane of ideas rather than borders. Written culture consolidated lasting connections. By considering intellectual and cultural Europe, it becomes evident that the continent was constructed as a community of knowledge. This construction did not result from geographical discovery, but from cumulative historical processes. Europe came to exist as an intellectual reference before asserting itself politically. European space gained meaning through the circulation of ideas, languages, and cultural practices. This intellectual dimension did not replace other forms of organization, but preceded and influenced them. From this cultural foundation, new structures would emerge. It is within this context that the narrative moves toward its final stage.
From the transition to the modern era onward, Europe began to be organized through increasingly defined political structures. Centralized states consolidated administrative borders and their own systems of government. Diplomatic treaties came to regulate relations among kingdoms and empires. European space began to be conceived in terms of political balance and territorial jurisdiction. This organization did not eliminate conflict, but it created mechanisms and negotiation. Modern Europe did not emerge from geographical discovery. It asserted itself as an institutional space through successive historical agreements. The continent came to be experienced as an interconnected political system. The strengthening of nation-states contributed to this transformation. France, England, Spain, and other kingdoms consolidated stable administrations. Territorial sovereignty became a central principle of political organization. Borders began to be defended and diplomatically recognized. Europe started to be perceived as a set of states in constant interaction. This perception did not depend on absolute cultural unity. It was based on formal relations among governments. The continent gradually acquired institutional contours. Politics came to shape the idea of Europe. With the advance of modernity, legal and economic institutions also gained prominence. National legal systems were codified and standardized. European international trade intensified, creating economic interdependence. Banks, trading companies, and currencies began circulating among states. Modern Europe was structured through these formal connections. Integration was neither complete nor uniform. Even so, European space became recognizable as a common institutional field. The organization of the continent advanced on an administrative level. Europe ceased to be merely a cultural reference. In the 20th century, this institutional process reached a new stage. After large-scale conflicts, European states sought forms of structured cooperation. Supranational bodies were created to regulate the economy, politics, and the movement of people. Treaties established shared rules among distinct countries. Institutional Europe came to exist explicitly. This configuration did not erase national identities. It created an additional layer of organization. The continent began to be administered through shared institutions. Modern Europe asserted itself as a concrete historical project. The creation of a common currency in part of the continent reinforced this institutional dimension. The circulation of the euro symbolized economic integration among sovereign states. Central banks and regulatory bodies began operating on a continental scale. This institutional experience has no parallel in ancient or medieval history. It represents a specific stage in European construction. Modern Europe is defined by administrative and financial instruments. The continent gains institutional materiality. This materiality does not equate to discovery, but to deliberate historical organization. European institutions also produced a new form of belonging. Citizenship, rights, and duties began to be discussed on a continental scale. Mobility among countries was regulated by common norms.
institutional Europe began to influence the daily lives of millions of people. Even so, this institutional identity does not replace local or national identities. It adds to them. Modern Europe is constructed as an additional layer of organization. The continent comes to exist as an administratively lived reality. Historical construction reaches a practical dimension. By observing modern and institutional Europe, it becomes evident that the continent was not discovered, but structured over time. Institutions, treaties, and agreements gave concrete form to an ancient idea. Europe moved from a symbolic reference to a political administrative system. This process did not occur at once, nor in a linear fashion. It is the result of centuries of historical transformations. Modern Europe represents the most recent stage of its construction. With this, the narrative reaches the point at which the initial question can be revisited. It is from this complete trajectory that the closing becomes possible.
Throughout the entire narrative, the question who discovered Europe has been examined through multiple historical layers. From the earliest human migrations to the intellectual constructions of antiquity, Europe never appeared as an empty space waiting to be discovered. Ancient peoples already inhabited, crossed, and transformed this territory long before any conceptual definition existed. The idea of discovery, when applied to Europe, proves limited for explaining long and continuous historical processes. The continent existed physically before existing as a concept. This distinction between lived space and conceptualized space is central to understanding the initial question. The analysis showed that Europe did not emerge as an evident natural unit. In ancient history, the world was organized around the Mediterranean, not around closed continents. Ancient Greece, the accounts of Herodotus, and Greek mythology indicate that the name Europe first circulated as a symbolic reference. The term preceded any precise geographical definition. Europe was named before it was delimited. This process shows that the continent was gradually imagined, interpreted, and classified. There was no single moment of territorial revelation. Instead, there was an accumulation of perceptions over time. During the Roman Empire, Europe was likewise not conceived as an autonomous continent. Roman space was structured through provinces, roads, and cities, integrated into a broad imperial system. The dominant identity was Roman, not European. In the Middle Ages, Christendom reorganized space in a different way, replacing imperial logic with religious bonds. Europe began to be thought of as part of a Western Christian world. Even so, this conception was still far from a modern geographical definition. The continent continued to be understood more as a symbolic community than as a closed physical unit. With the development of intellectual and cultural networks, Europe began to exist as a space of circulation for ideas, knowledge, and shared references. Universities, scholarly languages, and common traditions created a Europe before any political consolidation. This process reinforced the sense of belonging without relying on clear natural borders. In the modern era, institutions, states, and treaties gave administrative and political form to the idea of Europe. Modern Europe was not discovered, but institutionally organized. Each stage added a new layer to the concept without erasing the previous ones. In this way, the historical answer to the initial question becomes clearer. No one discovered Europe in the classical sense of the word. The continent was not found, but constructed over millennia. Europe was inhabited, named, interpreted, reorganized, and institutionalized at different historical moments. What is now called Europe is the result of human migrations, intellectual constructions, cultural traditions, religious structures, and political arrangements. Discovery, in this case, is not an event, but a continuous process of definition. This is what distinguishes Europe from other classic narratives of discovery.
At this point, the question who discovered Europe fulfills its historical role. It does not point to a specific name or date, but leads to a deeper understanding of the continent's construction. Europe was not discovered because it was never absent from human history. It was always present, being lived in and reinterpreted as historical contexts changed. The final answer does not exhaust the complexity of the subject, but organizes the elements necessary to understand it. It is this complete historical trajectory that allows the question to be answered consistently. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell to receive more videos like this. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Write in the comments which topics or videos you would like to see next for me to bring here to the channel. And if you're interested in this kind of subject, take a look at the video, Who Were the Forbidden Children of Angels and Humans in the Bible, which might interest you as well. Thank you very much for watching till the end, and see you in the next one.